Our first speaker today is Ruby Grantham. Ruby, can you please turn on your microphone and your camera and share your screen? Ruby is from James Cook University. I can see you there, Ruby.
Hello.
Her talk is on spatiotemporal determinants of seasonal gleaning in dynamic coastal livelihoods. Thank you, Ruby.
Hi, good morning, and thanks for a really great start to the day. I hope that everyone can see my screen. So I'm going to start today talking about the work I've been doing on dynamic coastal livelihoods, and this specific piece of research is actually currently under review, so fingers crossed it will be available quite soon. So just to start off with a brief background on natural resource-based livelihoods. So globally, the livelihoods of the rural poor tend to be quite heavily dependent on natural resource-based activities, such as small-scale fisheries. And these activities create direct interactions between people and nature, and so they are sensitive to and drive changes in linked social ecological systems. And natural resource-based livelihoods also tend to be diversified, and that means that households and individuals participate in multiple activities as a way of maximising returns and minimising risk. For instance, by having diversified livelihoods, households gain multiple benefit streams such as food and income, and also they can shift focus between activities depending on what's possible or has the greatest returns. So being dynamic is one of the most important features of diversified livelihoods because flexibility, oh, something's just happened to my screen. Sorry, is that working? Ooh. Okay. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. Yeah, so being flexible is one of the most important determinants of having adaptive and dynamic livelihoods. So seasonality is one of the key driver of diversified livelihood dynamics because the changes in weather and environmental resource accessibility and availability determines the timing of livelihood structures. So for example, with rain-fed agriculture, the timing of the rains determines when crops are planted and therefore when they're harvested. Whilst in something like fisheries, things like seasonal wind conditions can influence the possibility of fishing. So small-scale fishers can't often access the sea when the waves are big or the sea is rough. And so you end up with these dynamic livelihood structures shaped by these interactions between different livelihood activities. And even though seasons are predictable, the thing about seasons in natural resource dependent livelihoods is that you end up with these recurring multifaceted hardships. So it can drive acute hunger, and actually seasonal hunger is the main cause of food insecurity globally. So understanding the influence of seasons on livelihoods is crucial for food security and sustainably managing resources. So okay, so as I was saying, diversified livelihoods are often structured around seasonal dynamics. And so what I've been doing in my PhD is examining seasonal dynamics in coastal livelihoods using Timor-Leste as a case study. And so Timor-Leste has this acute food security occurring every year as a result of the heavy dependence on rain-fed agriculture. And so from about November to February every year, most households suffer acute food shortages because their stored food runs low and the new crops are not yet ready to be harvested. And Otaro is Timor-Leste's only populated sub-island, and it's a steep and rugged island, and it's surrounded by these narrow fringing reefs. And infrastructure on the island is really poor, with almost no running water or electricity and no paved roads. And on Otaro, livelihoods are diversified, and fisheries play a key role as part of these livelihoods because they provide an important source of nutrition and also income. But on Otaro, there's also a growing tourism industry, which is attracted by the beaches and the diving, and it's also at the centre of a national network of locally managed marine protected areas. And so the management of the coastal resources on Otaro Island really needs to balance these needs of stakeholders. So crucially, understanding how fisheries fit into livelihoods is going to be really important for ensuring that coastal management doesn't undermine local well-being. And one of the fishing methods used by households on Otaro is the gleaning activity. And gleaning is basically this collection of marine organisms from intertidal habitats, typically at low tide. And it's carried out by women who use knives or metal sticks to pry and stab at target species, including crabs, fish, mollusks, eels, and sometimes seaweed. And gleaning isn't just widespread on Otaro, it's also really important across the Pacific in other parts of the world. And it's a low risk, low returns activity. So one of the key narratives around gleaning in livelihoods has been that it's important for smoothing variability in seafood consumption that comes from more variable fishing activities. But really, gleaning has been underrepresented in fisheries assessments because of gender bias and a focus on more economically valuable activities. And so we know very little about its function in coastal livelihoods. And so in this research, I answered the following 3 questions. How does gleaning fit into dynamic fishing strategies? What is the relationship between gleaning and seasonal variability in seafood consumption? And what determines the decision to glean in different seasons? And we used household survey data collected in 8 coastal communities, as well as satellite-derived bathymetry available online, and distinguished between the rough and the calm season, because on Otaro, this is the main driver of fishing activities. And you can see that the rough season coincides almost exactly with the lean season. And so this is a really stressful time for livelihoods in Otaro Island. So firstly, I looked at how households participate in gleaning and non-gleaning activities at different times of the year. And what we found is that in both seasons, the same number of households basically did gleaning, but in the rough season, they were more likely to only glean and less likely to do these other types of fishing activities. And then when we looked at how households moved between the different activities, what you can see is that some households glean in both seasons, others glean in one season or the other, while some never glean at all. And so really the role of gleaning in fishing strategies differs between households. And I then wanted to explore how the relationship between those seasonal gleaning patterns kind of played out in the stability of seafood consumption between seasons. So the colors in this graph correspond with those seasonal gleaning trends, and values on the y-axis closer to 1 essentially show households who are able to maintain their seafood consumption in the rough season compared to the calm season. And because seafood is a vital source of protein and micronutrients in the study communities, being able to maintain seafood year-round is really important for food security. And what the analysis found was that gleaning in the rough season was what mattered. So if you gleaned in only the rough season or year-round, you had more stable seafood consumption than if you only gleaned in the calm season or not at all. And so this highlights that really it's the timing of activity that determines the role of gleaning in household food security. So this leads to the question, well, if gleaning in the rough season is so important, why do so many households not do it, including those that do glean in the calm season? And to answer that, I went on to model a bunch of household socioeconomic indicators with coastal habitat variables against seasonal gleaning. And what we found is that shallow habitat was really important. So in the bottom left, you can see a forest plot showing the effect size of the different variables. And above that is a map showing Otaro Island with each of the communities with a 2-kilometer buffer. And in the panels on the right, you can see the benthic habitat within each of those buffer zones. So the hard-bottomed shallow benthos is shown in dark green, and the light blue shows the other types of shallow habitat. And what the results show is that in the calm season, households with more female members and in communities with larger areas of shallow habitat were more likely to glean. And this is unsurprising because shallow habitat provides potential gleaning grounds, and gleaners are typically women. But then in the rough season, the area of shallow habitat is still important, but the percentage that is covered in hard-bottom benthos is also important. So now in the bottom corner, you can see these kind of geographic trends in seasonal gleaning across the communities. And this is where the influence of habitat becomes really evident. So in communities A and B, where there's very large shallow habitat, but a low proportion of this is hard-bottom benthos, all households gleaned in the calm season, but a lot of them stopped in the rough season. And when we spoke to the members in these communities, they told us that the water gets dirty in the rough season. And so that means that basically there's an increase in turbidity. Whilst in the south of the island, where there's very limited shallow habitat, gleaning is uncommon, and particularly in the rough season, because essentially there's very limited gleaning grounds and they're not protected from the waves. Whilst on the west coast, what we have is high stable gleaning, and these hard bottomed shallow habitats are protected from the waves and they don't suffer from turbidity. And I don't have time to talk about community H today. There was some problems with the benthic data, so I'm sorry about that. But overall, what these results highlight is that it's the interplay between coastal topography and sea conditions that determine the decision of a household to glean. And so why does this matter, and what are the wider implications of our findings? Well, firstly, this research demonstrates that timing is really important for the role that activities play in livelihoods. So as well as thinking about diversity, we should really also be incorporating dynamism into our evaluations of resilience and adaptive livelihoods. Secondly, seasons are a key determinant of household decision-making. So at coarser temporal scales, we might be overlooking some of the key variability that determines household decision-making and the realities of resource users. So to understand how livelihoods shape social ecological processes in coastal systems, we need a seasonal lens. Thirdly, we have shown that livelihood dynamics and resource use can differ at fine spatial scales. So when making sweeping assumptions about patterns of resource use and management, we have to be really careful about not overlooking these important differences. And finally, this research highlights that we need a better understanding of gleaning. So similar to other studies, we did show that gleaning was important for food security, and it does play an important role in smoothing seasonal variability in seafood consumption. But we also show that there are limitations to the role of gleaning in food security. And so there's a more nuanced narrative of the function of gleaning in coastal livelihoods. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to all the co-authors on this research, to the Coral Reef Centre, World Fish and Crawford Fund for all their support, and of course to all the research assistants and the households who participated in this research. Thank you.